Hello everybody, and welcome back to another video. In today's video, we're back on votehub.com. We're looking today at black voters specifically. We're going to continue doing some demographic level analysis of the 2024 election. We're going to talk a lot about the swing states, but also about the country as a whole, what happened last year, what we can understand through these tools. And so if you haven't done so already, do go check out my video where I talk specifically about Hispanic voters and obviously the shift that they had towards Donald Trump. Now we're talking about black voters who were still, as you can see, very pro Kamala Harris, but a bit less so than in 2020 for Joe Biden. So before I get into the video here, I do want to say this is a free tool, votehub.com. It is an unbelievably, cool resource that I am just so happy we have, right? This is a level of rigor that is really hard to find almost anywhere else. And this is kind of like, it's a project done by a number of collaborators, free to us, people who don't have like political connections or don't work for campaigns who are able to pay for these resources. So just an unbelievable tool that is just really purely like at our disposal. And I think that we should all be really grateful for that. And this is one of the, I rarely say this, and I'm not being sponsored to say this, but like this is one of those things where we ought to keep it free. And, this is one of the things where like, especially in the era where we don't have 538 anymore, we have to really appreciate the political resources we have. We have to really be sure to utilize these things. So I'm not being sponsored by VoteHub. I only know a couple of the guys who are behind it, but just such a great tool. So let's talk about black voters today. And I want to start, we're going to concentrate on the swing states, but I want to start in Alabama, where Alabama, because Alabama really can tell us so much about this equation. Now, Alabama, obviously, is a state, has a significant black population. It's still majority white, but it does have a significant black population. And what it doesn't really have, to a large extent, obviously, this is a blanket statement, but it doesn't have a huge, huge swaths of Hispanic voters or of Asian voters, right? And so in Alabama, what you have is kind of an electorate that is like nearly, I think, 94% either black or white, maybe a little higher than that, maybe 95%, maybe 93%, give or take. But like, what you have in Alabama is an electorate where the level of racial polarization makes it so you can predict the vote of a person with like 80 to 85% accuracy just based on their race, which is insane, right? Like in other states, it's maybe like you can predict it with like 60% accuracy based on their race. But like in Alabama, it is extremely polarized based on race, where black voters are overwhelmingly Democratic and white voters are overwhelmingly Republican. Now, if we take a look at the nation as a whole, you can see Kamala Harris got around 86% of the black vote, Donald Trump under 14%. It's a pretty good showing for Trump. He did about 2 to 3 points better than he did in 2020, maybe even a little more. Certainly better than, say, Mitt Romney, who probably only got around 5 to 7% of the black vote nationally in 2012. And so what we can do is we can look at this state of Alabama to see kind of what we get in like a max polarized state. So we'll look at white voters only, and we will look only at Alabama. And as you can see, the precincts get pretty red. There's a couple, there are a couple precincts in Alabama that are blue, where white voters are Democratic, right? Mostly in the cities of Birmingham, Huntsville, and Montgomery, but like deep red, right? These are precincts that Donald Trump, got like 94% of the vote among white voters. That's an unprecedented level of racial polarization. Now, as you can see here, the statewide tally, Kamala Harris lost the white vote in Alabama by about 1 million out of 1.5 million cast. So she only got 18% of the vote there. And then if we go to black voters, she got about 87% of the vote with black voters in Alabama. 87% for Harris, 13% for Trump. Obviously, these are not like evenly weighted variables. There are more white voters in Alabama than black voters, so Trump won Alabama decisively. But what you do get is white voters who were 83% for Trump and black voters who were 87% for Harris. Makes it pretty clear that we have a pretty racially polarized electorate in the state of Alabama. And there are obviously a few precincts where there are small numbers of voters where the calculations show that Trump maybe won black voters in the precincts. But again, the smaller the precinct is, the less accuracy you can predict. Whereas larger precincts, right, like say here, where you have nearly 1,000 votes cast, it's more favorable to Kamala Harris. I mean, this one precinct here, 735 votes among black voters, Harris 99%, Trump 1%. And so why do we focus on Alabama? Well, the reason is because Alabama, I believe, is a state that is pretty socially conservative, and I think most people would agree, pretty traditionally conservative, and Democrats are not really active here in the sense that they don't really spend a lot of time, fundraising or rallying here or really putting in serious investment, right? Democrats nationally and, even locally, right, they focus on the swing states because they're competitive there and because they can win there, right? In Alabama, whether it's a governor's race or a presidential race, Democrats are usually not competitive. And so there's less infrastructure there to win over voters or even to create turnout. And so in Alabama, what is the group that is most favorable to Democrats? It's black voters. And Democrats have a lot less infrastructure to energize turnout among that demographic or to, even like I would like even do things as simple as like maybe recruiting from that demographic to like work statewide and to like build campaigns, just because there are fewer resources allocated to Alabama at the federal level from the national party, right? Obviously, if you're a Democrat, you're going to put in a lot of money to Michigan or to neighboring Georgia, not as much in the state of Alabama. And so I think that creates a situation where going forward, there's a lot of room to fall. And you can kind of see this, like if you look at the shift from 2020 nationally, right? Or actually not nationally, but really in Alabama, where Donald Trump did a bit worse in like the suburbs of Birmingham, but for the most part, a lot of red, not a lot of blue. And the red is especially prevalent in areas that have huge black populations, right? Like look at these counties across here where if we just look at the winners, Kamala Harris won these precincts, right? Most of these precincts swung towards Trump even if he didn't win them. Look at downtown Birmingham. Kamala Harris won these precincts and they swung towards Trump. And so what that means is, and I think this is like something that's really important to note, what that means is that there is a lot of room to fall going forward for Democrats as we started to see in 2024. So right now, especially in this bluer part of the state, kind of from Montgomery to Tuscaloosa, Democrats get like 90% of the vote among black voters in this area, right? And I think that a lot of that's going to start to fall down because we already saw it start to fall a little bit in 2020, right? Mostly, minor shift towards Trump. And as Democrats continue to not invest in these areas, and as Republicans continue to improve, not only with just voters of color in general, but also with socially conservative voters, right? That's going to be a recipe for success for the GOP, I think, going forward, right? And we have to talk about what I think is kind of like a kind of not return to the norm because it's not really the norm, but like kind of a like an intersection of like cultural beliefs and political beliefs. I think this is a like firm tenet of like my like not worldview but like my like interpretation of American politics, which is that we have seen, especially in the past 5 years, especially post-COVID, people are now voting a lot more similarly to the way that they think socially and culturally. It's less about economics or about like, maybe interpretations of events or of history. It's more about feelings and culture. And that is why, for example, Donald Trump, I think, did really well with a lot of socially conservative Hispanic voters who voted for Obama and even Hillary Clinton, maybe even Joe Biden, because these voters, were Democrats for the majority of their life. Maybe they agreed with Democratic policies fiscally, but they began to prioritize social issues, right? And a lot of those voters in South Texas who are Hispanic, who don't have college degrees, but who are really religious, are socially conservative, and they're going to start voting Republican. And with black voters in states like Alabama, there are a lot of rural voters, who are black, who do not have college degrees, who are very socially conservative as well, who've been voting for Democrats, but are beginning to shift away from that. And we saw that in 2020, even where like Joe Biden did a little bit worse in some rural black counties than Hillary Clinton. We saw it a lot in 2024, though, where Kamala Harris fell among black voters, especially in rural areas. And so when you look at Alabama, you can kind of see that, and it might not be consequential there, but in Georgia, it's absolutely consequential, where if we look at that state, black voters are pretty similar. They were very strong for Kamala Harris. She got around 88% of the black vote, and she did especially well in Atlanta and the suburbs of Atlanta, but she also did pretty well across rural Georgia. But if we look at the swing from 2020, well, we see that most of these areas around here were pretty red in this swing. A few parts of Augusta were bluer, but, Georgia across the center of the state got redder. And so I want to talk about specifically Georgia and North Carolina today because you have a lot of these areas where Democrats do pretty well with rural black voters, but are bleeding pretty hard. And so that is going to be a problem for them going forward because if we look at black voters in Georgia as a whole, let's go back to demographics. If we look at black voters in Georgia as a whole and we see what happened here, Kamala Harris lost Georgia by about 2%, and she won black voters by about, 77%, which is equivalent to well over 1 million votes. You need every margin or like every, I should say, ounce of strength from that coalition that you can get. Because when you're losing white voters the way that you're losing white voters, and as Kamala Harris did in Georgia, right? Like if we look at white voters in Georgia, what we see is that Kamala Harris did not do well at all. She won white voters in Atlanta, did pretty well in Athens, which is where the University of Georgia is. A few cities she did okay, but statewide, she lost them by over 1 million votes, and it was a margin of 40% over that. So you cannot afford to lose black voters to any degree, let alone to the extent that we've been seeing in kind of the center of the state, where outside of metro Atlanta, it's been really dicey for Democrats. And in Burke County, Georgia is a good example of this, right? Like, it's actually really cool we can do this. Burke County, Georgia. If we look this up, let's see. Yeah, right here, they got 16 precincts. And if we look at white voters here, 83% for Donald Trump. But let's look at now black voters for Kamala Harris, right? Let's go to black voters here, because this is a county that voted for Hillary Clinton. Then, that's the wrong Burke County. Voted for Hillary Clinton, then voted for Donald Trump in 2020. And so Kamala Harris got 82% of the vote here. This is a county that's but half black, half white. And so really it comes down to, does the Republican win white voters by more, or does the Democrat win black voters by more? And so if you look at the swing from 2020, Kamala Harris got 82% among black voters in Burke County. Shift from 2020, every precinct got redder. Every precinct got redder. These are rural black voters who have been voting for Democrats every election for decades, who are now trending away from the party. In this one county, I know it's a small county that doesn't really have a huge impact on the state, but it is a microcosm of what's happening here. And you see the county got 8% redder because mostly black voters swung away from Kamala Harris. And that's a pretty unbelievable sight to behold. And it's in a swing state. It's not even Alabama anymore. This is a swing state where Democrats have improved in some areas, like the suburbs of Atlanta, but are doing really poorly in these rural areas, both with white voters and black voters. Obviously, white voters are a problem for Democrats too, but we're talking about black voters in today's video. And so that, I think, to me, that is a really interesting phenomenon where people, and I think it's because of the cultural thing, you have a lot of rural black voters who maybe are more culturally conservative who are trending away from the Democratic Party because of social issues. And so in North Carolina, you can see that up here in Don Davis's congressional district. Now, if we look at the swing, a lot of red, not a whole lot of blue. Donald Trump did not do too well in Raleigh or around Charlotte or even especially in Asheville, but he did pretty well. He held up pretty well in these areas up here kind of near the Virginia border. Now, if we look at the just general results, what you can see, let's actually do it in margins, give you a bit more depth. What you can see is that Kamala Harris still won these precincts, right? These precincts are majority black, but that, again, they swung towards Trump. And if we look specifically at black voters in North Carolina, we're going to go back to let's go to the state of North Carolina, and we focus on black voters here. What we see is that they're still pretty strong for Kamala Harris, right? She got 85% of the black vote in North Carolina. She won it by around 700,000 votes, a little more than that. But that, these areas are majority black. They still did swing to the right. And so with those swings, I think we kind of are confirming something, which is that Democrats have a lot of room to fall, and we're beginning to see that fall in many areas. We see it in Alabama, and then we see it in the swing states of Georgia and North Carolina. And so this is a phenomenon that's happening everywhere, but it's a broader part of the theme that I pointed out earlier in this video, as well as in the video, but Hispanic voters, which is that people are beginning to vote the way that they kind of feel culturally. And that might benefit Democrats in some suburbs that are more socially moderate or liberal, but it doesn't really help them a lot with rural voters in general, and that includes rural black voters who have been huge for Democrats in the past. It's the reason that Joe Biden won Georgia in 2020, but going forward could be really interesting. So that's just a trend I wanted to focus on today. I'm going to keep talking about these demographics. Again, so much to learn from votehub.com, and I hope to see you all in the next video.